I started off looking at recomposition for binaural reproduction. So, with the fundamental question of how can 3D record production technique enrich the musical experience beyond that of stereo, that then led into a question of how do we structure a 3D soundstage. I started off on the Auro 3D system, which is a 13.1 array at the University of West London, and I was using their creative tool suite with the intention of folding that down into headphones. I chose headphones, and one of my main focuses is because then it negates such complicated and expensive speaker arrays. It's also a fundamental, it's in keeping with current user listening trends. So, you know, most people have a pair of headphones and a mobile phone, as you were saying, Sebastian. And I think if 3D audio is going to move into the kind of like commercial music industry, you need a convenient and cost-effective way of reproducing it. So, it's a practice-led musicological study, so I'm not so scientific. You know, it's all about the creative application and then the musical experience that 3D audio record production can afford. Specifically looking at development of a 3D production technique and its creative effect, paraphonic staging, challenging front-orientated listening. So I'm not about the traditional front, left, right soundstage anymore. That was afforded only for stereo based upon, you know, live music and live performance. And if we've got this like well, I work in a hemispherical domain rather than a spherical one, but if we've got all of this space, then why waste it? It's pretty much following the same route as 5.1 and other sort of like single-tiered surround sound formats. So, one of the most important things, I think, is looking at a democratic approach to music production. So, I want to steer clear from complicated ambisonic setups, ambi-mic arrays, 3D audio, multi-tiered ambient recording mic arrays, max MSP. I wanted to find a workflow that anybody could use. Bedroom musicians, professionals, composers, because now this has become a fantastic compositional tool. You know, it started out that I just used to take stems from stereo pieces and kind of remix them in the 3D domain and then decode that for headphones. And now I've actually started using the 3D domain as an influence into my creative compositional process. My data collection and analysis is through listening tests and analysing my workflow and the creative practice. So as I said, there are two fundamental things, application and so how, why, what, the experience, and then how these two are also entwined. So the application sort of, the application informs the experience, and then the experience then informs the application. Oh, did someone? Oh, sorry. I thought I heard a camera thing, and I thought maybe they were taking a picture. When perception proceeds in an unproblematic way, we're usually unaware of the sensory aspects of the stimulus, attending only to the events specified by the stimulus structure. When that relationship is problematic, the stimulus structure itself can become more evident. This sums up exactly what I've spent the crux of my time doing, which is instead of actually looking at the production techniques as I'm doing now, I spent so long trying to actually find a way to get it into headphones. You know, so like I said, I started off on this like 13.1 speaker system. Or I did actually have a headphone decoder that I was planning to use, which is why I started on the speaker system. And they pulled it, like, just as my proposal was verified. So I spent now, like, the last year and a half or so trying to find a way in which I can do this. Because in order to create, in order to define and develop the production techniques, I needed a suitable, you know, way of. I found that. Oh no, I'm stumbling over my words. I needed a suitable way of the suitable way of getting it into headphones, basically. Because to define those things on a speaker system and it not translate, would prove problems, and my PhD would be full of holes. I wouldn't be able to check. One of the most important things was looking at translation. So defining whether headphone decoding distorts the spatial aesthetic, the variation between headphones, looking at phantom image stability and the different decoders and generalized HRTFs, how they're going to impact the perception of the production. And then also workflow, so finding something that, again, could be democratized, something that's not overly complicated. And my workflows were pretty complicated, as you can see here. So I started recomposing the stereo mixes 13.1. Without having the headphone decoder, I then had to convert that legacy audio to third order ambi. I used the Blue Ripple 03A plugin suite to do this. And then that binaural decoder to get it into headphones. The problem is there was such a limited creative agency in terms of, it was like a blind mixing. So I was mixing on the speaker array without any idea of how this was going to translate to the headphones, how it was going to sound. And then by the time I got through that process, even though I was really happy the fact that it worked, and I did get the production response that I was kind of after, but it was still quite skewed, and there were things that they didn't translate from the array to headphones. So I then had to try and rethink, and the ideal would be to start from headphones in the first place, so that I can monitor and mix in real time, and I know what I'm doing. It's not mixing blind as it was on this system. Plugin Alliance released their DVR plugin, and that to me felt like the answer. It's a plugin. It was affordable. Anybody can use it. You don't have to have, even though it's ambi-based, you don't have to have an understanding of ambisonics in order to utilise its potential. You can binaural output or you can ambi output. So there's two different ways that you could do that. You could, I have been doing it with the binaural output, so I've been summing binaural basically. But you can also ambi output that and then use the 03A headphone decoder to get that into headphones in the master output. Oh, why does it keep doing this? Sorry, I thought I'd turned it off. So yeah, that allowed me more creative agency, real-time monitoring, and it was far more spatial and coherent. I could actually do the things that I needed to do, and now I had an appropriate way of being able to define and develop 3D staging and production techniques. Obviously, in terms of variation of headphone, I did a kind of preliminary test using earbuds, on-ear and over-ear. The on-ear and over-ears were both closed back. But I wanted to see if what the variation between these were, because that's another thing. If I'm defining production techniques and I'm using over-ear, and then on earbuds it's completely different. Again, it's kind of holes in my PhD and a bit fruitless in terms of a venture. Earbuds generally work best across the board. There's heavy presence on the on-ears, and the over-ears there's a lot more ambience. Things sound a lot more spaced, but not necessarily more spatial. There are localization issues, but they're quite minor. And with the DVR, none distort dramatically enough to really detract or invalidate the production or data. So the way I work at the moment is still very similar to actually how I worked on the Oro 3D system. And that's I still work in 3 tiers, so a low, a height level, and then the top. But I also work in a quadrant, so I've got front, left and right, and rear, left and right. And I try and, with most mixes, it's all about balance. So if I've got something in the front, I try and put something responsive and interactive in the back as well. Same with left and right, and also on the diagonal and between the height layers. this sort of helps create a more coherent mix, and obviously then doesn't leave your audio lopsided. I arrange instrumentation by the frequency content and also the context of the music. So it's very similar to what Simon was talking about yesterday, if you were in his Sonic Cartoons presentation, but about metaphor and simile. So we'll talk a bit about that later on, but actually no, we can talk about it now. So there's this immersive choral effect that I defined. In terms of the vocal staging, I was looking at arranging it again in terms of its pitch and register. So the lower vocal ranges on the lower layers, and then as the ranges increase and the registers increase, then the positioning in the height layers will get higher. In particular, there's one track called Far From Here, and another one called Monomorphic, where I've sort of done a similar thing in terms of pairing the vocals. So the vocal content itself, I've arranged in pairs. So 1 and 3 were kind of like lower pitched oohs, 2 and 4 were higher pitched ahs, and then 5 is a very, I mean I can barely sing that high, but a very high pitched ah. And that in itself creates this wonderful choral effect without needing chorus, and in a sense, just even though it's the same voice and you know that it's the same person, it really gives it an actual sense of choir. You don't realize, you kind of forget that it's 5 vocal lines sung by the same person, and think of it more like this sort of domed choral effect of St. Paul's Cathedral or something. At least that's what I get from it. In Far From Here as well, and I appreciate you guys don't know my music, but there's a link at the end that you can go online and listen to my private SoundCloud playlist. So hopefully this will all make sense if you do that. But as I was saying, conceptually based production. Here so the lyrics go far, far from there, goes anywhere than here, for example. What I did was then create this really cool sense of movement by panning inward the vocals. So in the beginning they start quite far out because of far, and then the here, they just appear next to you. I then also use a bit of high frequency compression to give this sort of sense of intimacy and create an even more breathy feeling. None of these things really could have been so effective. I mean, you could still do something similar to this. This is like a kind of production technique that could be used with stereo. But in terms of like the choral effect, that certainly wouldn't have been able. I wouldn't have been able to have done that using a standard stereo system. So the 3D can actually afford us, a hyper-realistic production, and actually I think far more creativity than stereo or 5.1 or surround sound formats of the past. I've done some other things as well, like using reverb as movement. So I kind of created what I called like the heavenly voice. So I was imagining this sort of hand of God coming out of the clouds, these like fingers of light, and how I could kind of auralize that. And with the vocal being positioned in, the overhead, the ceiling. Well, it's not really a ceiling speaker, it's not there, but positioned above your head, and the reverb rolling down to create this even more sense of immersion, and that worked pretty well as well. I mean, as far as I feel. Conceptual blending as well, so like merging spaces. So this is quite interesting. It's not that I put a plugin on every single audio track I have. Some things, like I created this almost like a space outside of the 3D space. So you've got this binauralized in your head sound, and then you also have this larger space where I've left things in a stereo field. So I had these 2 similar synth tracks, again in Far From Here, similar enough that I could pan them left and right and they still sounded like the same sort of sound source and cohesive, but different enough that when I hard panned them left and right and left them in the stereo field, they created this weird sort of warping and this tunneling, almost like you were going through like a hyperspace, you know. And I really loved that. There was another like sonic cartoon that would never have been afforded in a stereo production, and I think has totally bettered the music. More reverb as movement as well. I created like actual space in the mix without using reverb as the space. I basically panned the reverb return channels. So I had the kick on the kind of like the rear left and the snare on the rear right-ish, side left, side right, and then I front panned their reverb, and it created like almost like a slapback, and again gave this sort of depth that I never thought would have been possible without being able to have oppose panned those sounds. Yeah, so the results in delivering a slapback spatial effect that creates a hyper-realistic perception and illusion of a tunnel. And this is, yeah, so you can create movement using static sound sources. They don't necessarily have to be kinetic, and I found that actually having more than one kinetic sound at once just completely complicates and muddies the piece. Another way also I found of creating a better sense of movement. So humans are perceptually more sensitive to changes than they are constant. So I found having this like spiraling hi-hat, after a while, you know, initially you're like, oh wow, it's moving, and then after a while you kind of forget about it. It kind of disappears into the background. And I found that making changes actually created more impact than continually moving sounds or kinetic production. So here what I did was, in order to make it more noticeable that there were stops, I put these percussive hits in. So I'd half pan a sound around, and then at its stopping point, like, put something like yeah, it was kind of, I don't know, I can't remember exactly how I made that sound, but it was like this kind of like, dunk. And that in itself made it feel like the travelling sound had hit like a dead end. It had hit a brick wall. And it created more impact and movement than the sound just stopping. Similar in theory to implementing the micro vacuum. I learned that term yesterday. Yeah, which is, I'll explain, when you know you've hit like a chorus or something and you put a pause in the music, like a piece of silence, just to allow the listener to forget the previous reference point and give it more impact and perceive it to be a bit louder than the previous phrase. So it's very similar to that, but oh my god, I'm stumbling over myself. Sorry guys, I'm just not on form. And yeah, of course, many of these techniques are just not possible in stereo or single-tiered surround. So key elements of interest. My project does not respect the front at all. And this has actually been very interesting in terms of people's listening behaviour. I found that people who have X amount of music experience, engineers, you know, musicians, composers, can listen to it and all kind of automatically realise there's sounds coming from all around them. That they get the height and they get the rear. A lot of people that have listened to this that don't necessarily have any musical background, without being leading, it kind of comes across like they don't perceive the height until I might mention it. And then they listen and then get it. So that's quite interesting. And as much as I'd like to look into that, I think that's probably like for another PhD. Yeah, and then some people also, like the composer I work with, he actually gets a slightly different spatial perception. Same headphones, same track, but when he listens to it, instead of it feeling like the dome like I get, like I'm wearing a bob of spatial sound, he gets this sort of kind of slightly tilted forward tunneled effect. You know, so his height is kind of here. And I reached the end, finally. There's the link, guys. Just, you know, if you want to have a listen. I'm going to apologise because that really wasn't like my best presentation ever. But can I take any questions?
Yes, the link.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. Sorry, I've got timings on these slides still, clearly. Oops. Yeah, so please have a listen and, like, you know, give me some feedback, talk to me about what you think. Yeah?
Just going back to headphone listening, and you touched on it at the end, like with binaural decodes, like people can obviously experience them in different ways. Just two things. Are you allowing the end listener to choose their own HRTF when they're listening back, or are you advising on one? And secondly, are you using any headphone normalization if you're going across different sets of headphones?
There's no headphone normalization, and no, they don't get to pick, because it's, I still treat the process as I would as if I was producing in stereo. So like once I've finalized the binaural output, that's it, that's the piece finalized. They don't get to listen differently. It's the DVR HRTFs,
Yeah.
basically. So there's no selection in that.
It's just so, people's binaural listening experiences can be so varied depending on the tiniest like measurement of things. So, I appreciate the way you framed it, and that you've given yourself that restriction, and you being like, yeah, I want that to be out, because you can really go as far as to go, right, well, how long's a piece of string?
Well, yeah, exactly.
And
And to be honest, like, I haven't undertaken the listening tests yet, mainly because, so once I do, that will actually, the data collected from that will then help to show if there is such a large variation with the DVR output. But the problem I'm having with that is thinking of ways to phrase questions that do not lead or influence the answer I get. So I don't want to say, did you perceive height? Because now they'll be listening like, oh right, there's height. I want to just present it versus its stereo counterpart mix and kind of put a comparison in like that. But yeah, so the listening testing, I really feel like I should have done that by now. But the questioning is something I'm really, really struggling on. So in terms of variation, I don't know if there is actually such a great one.
I'm just thinking there'll probably be a lot of variation between listeners if you're using the same HRTF for everyone, and that might not necessarily be a reflection of your mix. So the results could be slightly skewed based on the people using the wrong HRTF when they're listening back. So. Yeah,
Yeah, I suppose perhaps for the listening test, definitely that would be a way forward to decode using a few different, and then maybe allowing them to preview before the questionnaire starts. But then you have to create like a kind of base.
It's difficult. I mean, like you were saying towards the end, like you've got a lot of different threads, each within themselves, which could be a PhD, and as soon as you start looking at personalised HRTFs for each individual listener, which would, in an ideal world, if it was that easy to do HRTFs of every one of your participants.
Yeah.
But like you say, how long is a piece of string? You could do a whole analyses on those mixes and corresponding HRTF.
You do get statistically optimised ones like Richard versus
Yes.
the kind of best catch-alls.
That's why I was also, you have the secondary workflow of being able, like I was saying, instead of doing the binaural summation and using the HRTFs within the DVR, but then just ambi output and use the Richard Furr's O3A binaural decoder instead. I mean, because that's the only reason why I negated Blue Ripple before is because the process that I was working with the Auro system was just so long-winded and complicated, and it didn't give me the creative freedom and the creative agency that I actually required in order to mix properly. You know, now I've found a different way of doing it. Yeah, I think probably I could revisit his decoder and utilise that, and then that'd be a really good comparison to see which of the two, in fact, not just I prefer, but maybe other people as well, which responds better. You, and then, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. That was really interesting and very detailed.
Oh, thank you.
I think what I'm understanding from the project is that it kind of functions as like an extension of pop music as like a spatial narrative. And I mean, definitely listen to the work, but I wonder if you can say a bit about how you are making kind of like creative mix decisions, like whether you have whether there's a kind of set of rules or intentions guiding your creative or your kind of spatialization decisions, and also maybe a bit about, you mentioned working with a composer as well, and maybe just maybe a bit about how you are putting the thing together in a collaborative sense.
So, as I said, let me go back to that. So, a lot of my initial experiments were with localization, and specifically like the height plane, the Z plane, and front-back localization. So there are a lot of production techniques in the first two pieces, Penny Drops and Monomorphic, that I created that were based on testing the phantom image stability in the phantom image stability between the height layers, but also oh God, what's wrong with my brain? So most of it was actually to test that sort of stability and whether kinetic sounds would work, if there were going to be any kind of phasing or kind of filtering issues. But having kind of moved on from that, then it was more about how I could tie the musical context and the musical concept in with the production. You know. So in terms of the Far From Here one, there was a lot of vocal work playing with the lyrical content.
Yeah.
You know, it may not necessarily have such, I think, an obvious impact, unless maybe I say that. But the decisions were kind of based upon how I envisioned the kind of the musical soundscape.
So you're imagining like a set of spatial relationships, and a set of spatialization decisions in relation to the kind of materials of the set record.
Yeah, I mean, and there were other things as well, like the Penny Drops one, where it's so these four pieces that are on this playlist are not, they're kind of like somewhere between electroacoustic, slightly experimental, and pop. Mostly because that's kind of how I work. That's what me and that composer make. We come from like a kind of industrial music background, and we experiment with a lot of acousmatic stuff. But I am wanting to take that more into the popular music realm. So I have some other tracks that I'm yet to finish mixing. So here I've got Jerome Thomas Late Nights, Jimmy Logic's Sega, and then a piece by Tony Castells as well, which is a modern opera. But I wanted to be able to work with my own music first, because I know it. And in a sense, like, even though when I started writing those pieces, like the first two, Penny Drops and Monomorphic, they'd already had, they're already in stereo format. The second two were not, and they were pieces that I had then composed almost within the 3D space. So in a sense, there was a lot of kind of like playing around as well. You know, what sounds good here, but my rules were really about the frequency content and then how it ties in with the concept of the music. So higher pitched sounds would be placed higher, you know, bassy low-end sounds would, sometimes actually what I would do is leave them in stereo and not even spatialize them. It really depended on the kind of sonic content, the spectral content of the instrumentation.
Thanks a lot.
Justin, I always dread your questions. Sorry.
Let's start with African capitals. I assume you're using fixed binaural, which obviously suffers from things like rather vague localization and front-back confusions.
Yeah.
What's the rationale of using fixed binaural as opposed to a head tracking system?
The head tracking. People do say this to me, but my thing with head tracking is if I was, say for a music video, something with a visual, head tracking would be fantastic, I think. But in terms of my mix, because they are conceptually tied in with the music, I am concerned that having a head tracking function would distort the kind of the production aesthetic I spent so long trying to achieve. You know, so for example, that tunneling feeling that was quite purposeful with the stereo panned synth tracks, creating this sort of out of your head versus inside your head movement. If people could move their head, then that kind of distorts the tunneling effect. That then takes away from the entire production concept. That's my reason for that.
The
I
parallel
think the
buttons
visual,
of one head track, one static stereo, if you like, in the FB360 model. That would get around that.
yeah.
You should check it out.
Yeah, I mean, I had
better
someone ask me the same question at Sounds in Space when in June when I presented, and that was my. Like, I'm open to playing with it, and I think for like a visual thing. Like I was looking at the U2 presentation yesterday with the VR, and I don't know. I think if you've got that visual reinforcement, then it's kind of cool. But I was just thinking that perhaps it confuses the production by, in a sense, allowing the listener to be able to sort of change the mix.
Well, that's where you started with 13.1, because that's head tracking by definition, because it doesn't move.
Yeah.
So I think you should check it.
Okay, I will do.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.